Major Ethan Carter made a promise to bring his fallen best friend home, a mission that should have been straightforward. But when delays, prejudice, and growing public attention turn his journey into a battle of its own, Ethan faces more than just the pain of loss. As obstacles mount, his mission becomes a fight for honor, respect, and the memory of his brother in arms. How far will Ethan go to keep his promise, and what will he uncover along the way? Follow this powerful story of duty, sacrifice, and justice. Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring journeys like this one. Ethan's story is one you won't want to miss. Major Ethan Carter knelt before the freshly dug grave, the dusty Afghan soil crumbling under his boots. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the events of the past few hours, the horrific ambush, and the fading pulse of his best friend, Sergeant Dave Thompson. The weight of what had happened sat heavily on his shoulders, his uniform stained with the dust and blood of the battlefield. The sun was setting behind the rugged mountains, casting a red-orange glow over the harsh terrain. The sound of military helicopters in the distance seemed to fade as Ethan stared down at the grave marker, not yet filled, but prepared. The men around him worked in solemn silence, readying the body for transport back to the States. Dave's body lay nearby, wrapped in an American flag, his name soon to be etched in stone alongside countless others who had fallen. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the moment that had changed everything. The attack had come swiftly, catching them off guard. They had been on a routine patrol, one they had done countless times before, but this time it was different. The enemy had struck with precision, and in the chaos of the ambush, Dave had taken the hit meant for Ethan. He could still hear Dave's labored breathing, see the blood pooling beneath him, feel the desperation of trying to keep his friend alive. "Get me home, Ethan," Dave had whispered through the pain, his voice barely audible. "Don't let them leave me here." It was a promise Ethan had sworn to keep. He had held Dave's hand as the life slowly drained from his body, his best friend slipping away in the midst of gunfire and chaos. Now, as he stood over Dave's body, Ethan knew that the mission wasn't over. The war had taken so much from both of them, but he wasn't going to let it take Dave's dignity. He would get him home. He owed him that much. Ethan glanced up, the desert wind ruffling his uniform as he looked at the men around him. They too had lost a brother, but the bond between Ethan and Dave had been different. They were more than just soldiers serving together. They were brothers in arms. Dave had always treated Ethan with respect, never letting race or background come between them, while others in their unit had sometimes given Ethan sideways glances, unsure of how to treat the black man who outranked them. Dave had never wavered. They had fought together, bled together, and survived together. And now Ethan was left to honor that bond in the only way he knew how, by keeping his promise. The flag was folded neatly, ready for its journey home. The paperwork for transporting Dave's body was in order, but as Ethan stood there, watching the preparations, he knew that the hardest part of the journey was yet to come. There would be no more battles, no more gunfire, but the obstacles that lay ahead, back home, were no less daunting. There were things he couldn't control, things he had faced his entire life, even in uniform. Prejudice, bureaucracy, and a world that sometimes refused to see him for the man he was, rather than the color of his skin. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting Dave home. The ride back to the base was heavy with silence. The military transport helicopter hovered above the barren landscape, the sun dipping lower behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the sand. Ethan sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on the casket in front of him, draped in the American flag. The rhythmic hum of the rotor blades was the only sound that broke the stillness, but to Ethan it barely registered. His mind was elsewhere, on Dave, on the promise he had made, and on the journey ahead. Inside the helicopter, the other soldiers maintained a respectful distance. They understood the gravity of what had happened, but they also knew that there was nothing to say. Grief was a silent companion on the battlefield, and in moments like this, words were inadequate. Ethan didn't need condolences, he needed to focus. His mission was no longer just about the war, It was about bringing his brother home. As the helicopter landed at the military base, Ethan steeled himself. He had done this before, escorted the bodies of fallen soldiers back to the States. But this time it was different. This time it was personal. He could still feel the weight of Dave's final request pressing down on him, a burden he was determined to carry. The base was a flurry of activity. Soldiers moved in organized chaos, preparing for the next mission, checking supplies, and coordinating flights. The war never stopped, even for a moment. But as Ethan stepped off the helicopter, his focus narrowed to one task: getting Dave's body home. Everything else faded into the background. A military liaison met Ethan as he approached the processing center. The man, dressed in a crisp uniform, held a clipboard and wore a solemn expression. He had done this many times before, met officers returning with fallen comrades, but he knew better than to offer empty platitudes. This was not the time for small talk. "Major Carter," the liaison said, his voice formal, "all the arrangements have been made. You'll be escorting Sergeant Thompson's body back to the U.S. From there, we'll coordinate with his family to ensure a proper burial." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the casket. "I want to make sure everything is in order. No delays." The liaison glanced at his clipboard, flipping through the paperwork. "Everything looks good on our end. The transport flight leaves in a few hours. We'll handle the casket with the highest level of respect." Ethan knew that the military followed protocol to the letter when it came to honoring the fallen, but still, he felt the need to oversee every detail. This wasn't just another body to be shipped home. This was Dave. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll stay with him until we board." The liaison nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of Ethan's words. "Of course, Major." The transport plane was cold and loud, its cargo hold filled with the hum of machinery and the soft clanking of military equipment. Ethan sat in the cramped space next to the casket, his eyes focused on the flag draped over it. Outside the small window, the night sky stretched endlessly in every direction, the plane cutting through the darkness as it crossed the Atlantic. It was a long journey, but one that Ethan had made before. Only this time, the sense of urgency was far more personal. The flight attendants, military personnel themselves, moved quietly through the cabin. They knew better than to disturb Ethan, though they offered him water and food with respectful nods. He politely declined, his stomach too knotted with grief and responsibility to accept anything. As the hours ticked by, Ethan's thoughts drifted. He had known Dave for years, ever since their first deployment together. They had clicked immediately, bonding over their shared experiences on the battlefield. But more than that, they had shared something deeper, a mutual respect that transcended their differences. Dave was the kind of man who didn't care where you came from or what color your skin was. All that mattered was how you carried yourself, how you fought alongside your brothers, and how you honored your commitments. Ethan remembered their late-night conversations in the barracks, the way they would talk about everything from their dreams of life after the military to the complexities of being black in America. Dave had listened, really listened, in a way that few people ever did. He had asked questions, wanted to understand, and had stood by Ethan when others had faltered. The military had its own set of rules, its own brotherhood, but there were still divides that lingered. Ethan had felt it his whole life, the sideways glances, the unspoken questions, the assumptions that followed him wherever he went. Even as an officer, with medals on his chest and years of service behind him, he knew that there were still people who doubted him, who questioned his right to stand where he stood. But Dave had never been one of those people. And now, Ethan would make sure that Dave was brought home with the respect and dignity he deserved. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, Ethan pulled Dave's dog tag from his pocket, the cool metal warm against his skin. He held it tightly, feeling the weight of the name engraved on it, the same name that now marked the casket beside him. He had promised Dave that he would get him home, and no matter what obstacles lay ahead, he intended to keep that promise. The plane touched down in the U.S. just before dawn. The transition from military life to civilian reality was always jarring, but this time it hit Ethan harder than usual. The base was quiet in the early morning light, the hum of jet engines slowly fading as the plane taxied to a stop. As the cargo door opened, a blast of cold air rushed in, filling the hold with the scent of jet fuel and wet tarmac. Ethan stepped off the plane, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him. His body ached from the constant tension, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for rest. He still had a long way to go. A small honor guard had gathered on the tarmac, waiting to transfer Dave's casket to the civilian airport. The soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms crisp and spotless, their faces solemn. Ethan watched as they carefully unloaded the casket, their movements slow and deliberate. He had seen this process many times before, but this time it felt different. This time it was Dave. The casket was placed into a hearse, which would transport it to the civilian airport for the final leg of the journey. Ethan followed closely, his gaze never leaving the flag-draped casket. He had been through too much with Dave to let anything go wrong now. At the airport, the transition from military precision to civilian bureaucracy was immediate. The honor and respect that had followed Dave's body in the military world seemed to dissipate as soon as they entered the terminal. Ethan could feel the shift in the air, the indifference of the people around him, the hustle and bustle of passengers rushing to their gates, oblivious to the weight of the mission he carried. He approached the check-in counter, his military uniform standing out among the crowd. The woman behind the counter glanced up, her expression polite but disinterested. "Ticket and ID, please," she said, her tone perfunctory. Ethan handed over his documents, including his military ID and the paperwork for the transport of Dave's casket. "I'm here to escort a military casket," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Sergeant David Thompson." The woman scanned the documents, her smile fading slightly as she read through them. Her eyes flicked up to meet Ethan's, a flash of suspicion crossing her face. "You're the officer in charge of the transport?" she asked, as though the idea surprised her. "Yes," Ethan replied, keeping his tone calm. "Everything is arranged." The woman hesitated, her fingers tapping on the keyboard in front of her. She leaned over to whisper something to her colleague, glancing at Ethan out of the corner of her eye. Though he couldn't hear what they were saying, he recognized the look all too well, the unspoken doubt, the subtle question of whether he belonged here, whether he was who he said he was. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he stood tall. He had been through this before, many times. People rarely questioned his service when they saw the uniform, but when they saw the color of his skin, something shifted. It was a quiet, insidious thing, something that most people wouldn't even recognize if they hadn't experienced it firsthand. But Ethan knew it well. "I'm going to need to check with my supervisor," the woman said finally, handing back the documents. "Just one moment, sir." Ethan nodded, watching as she walked away, her colleague casting another glance in his direction. He could feel the eyes on him, other passengers, other employees, wondering, perhaps, why a man like him was here, dressed in a military uniform, carrying such an important burden. The minutes stretched on, and Ethan's patience wore thin. He glanced at the clock on the wall, each passing second a reminder that Dave's family was waiting on the other side of this journey. They were grieving, holding on to the hope that their son would be buried with honor. And here he was, stuck in a civilian airport, waiting for someone to verify what should never have been questioned in the first place. The minutes turned into hours as Ethan waited for the airline staff to verify his documents. He stood near the counter, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes focused on the blinking departures board above. His flight was still scheduled, though a delay seemed almost inevitable given the way his luck had been running. Ethan's uniform usually commanded a certain level of respect, but here it felt more like a costume, something people saw and immediately questioned. He had been in the military long enough to recognize the subtle change in people's demeanor when they saw him, a black man in uniform, holding a rank that didn't seem to match the image they had in their heads. He had earned his rank, his medals, and his reputation on the battlefield. But here, in this busy civilian airport, none of that seemed to matter. The airport was a world away from the military precision and brotherhood he was used to. Here, people bustled through their lives, headphones in their ears, scrolling through their phones, utterly indifferent to what he was dealing with. The world had kept moving while he was fighting overseas, and now that he was back, it felt like he had been dropped into a place where no one understood the weight of his mission. After what felt like an eternity, the airline employee finally returned. A middle-aged man with graying hair and an annoyed expression trailing behind her. Ethan's stomach knotted again. He recognized this routine. Someone in a position of authority had to come out and double-check what had already been confirmed. "Colonel Carter," the man said, holding the documents as if they weighed 100 pounds. He glanced at Ethan briefly before scanning the paperwork again, his frown deepening. "Major," Ethan corrected, his voice even, though his patience was wearing thin. "It's Major Carter." The man looked up, his brow furrowing slightly before continuing. "Right, sorry about that. We just need to do some extra verifications. You understand? Protocol and all." Ethan didn't bother responding, knowing that pushing back wouldn't get him anywhere. His jaw tightened as the man flipped through the paperwork with unnecessary slowness. "Everything's in order," the man finally said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But we're going to need to escort you to a secondary security screening. Just a precaution, you understand?" "Of course," Ethan replied, his voice clipped. He knew exactly what this was, a so-called random security check that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with appearance. It was one of the oldest tricks in the book. Make it about protocol, about following the rules, when everyone involved knew it was something else entirely. Two uniformed TSA officers appeared within minutes, their expressions carefully neutral as they approached. Ethan met their eyes with a calm, unwavering gaze, but he could feel the knot in his chest tightening with each step. He had been through this before, too many times to count, and it never got any easier. "This way, sir," one of the officers said, gesturing for Ethan to follow them. Ethan glanced at the clock again before walking alongside the officers. Dave's body was already being prepared for transfer, and the delays were piling up. Every minute spent here was another minute stolen from his mission, another minute stolen from Dave's grieving family. But there was nothing he could do except cooperate and get through this. The TSA officers led him through a series of corridors, past curious passengers who cast sideways glances at the man in uniform being escorted by security. Ethan kept his face expressionless, though inside his frustration simmered. They reached a small, sterile room with a single metal table in the center. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow over the space. The officers motioned for him to step forward. "Place your belongings on the table, please," one of the officers instructed. Ethan complied, unclipping the medals from his uniform with careful precision, laying them down beside his identification and the small dog tag that had become a constant reminder of the promise he had made. He watched as the officers methodically searched through his items, their hands impersonal and indifferent. They even inspected the folded flag he carried for Dave, as if it might somehow be more than just a symbol of honor. Every second felt like a slap to his dignity, but Ethan stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back as he waited for the process to finish. He knew better than to give them any reason to drag this out. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation. When the search was finally complete, one of the officers nodded. "You're clear, Major Carter." Ethan reattached his medals with slow, deliberate movements, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the anger he had to constantly suppress. He had been through worse on the battlefield. He would not break here, not in front of these men, and certainly not when his mission was so close to being completed. As the officers opened the door, Ethan walked out without a word, his back straight, his resolve unshaken. He wasn't going to let this stop him. Not now, not ever. Back in the terminal, the crowd had thinned out, but the energy was still restless. Passengers milled about, waiting for their delayed flights, pacing and checking their phones. Ethan glanced up at the departures board and felt his stomach drop. His flight was now officially delayed. Another obstacle. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Delays were common enough, but it felt like the universe was conspiring against him today. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong, and yet none of it surprised him. He had learned long ago that no matter how prepared you were, no matter how well you followed the rules, there was always something that could trip you up. He approached the airline desk again, determined to get some answers. A young woman, different from the one he had dealt with earlier, was standing behind the counter, scrolling through her tablet with a look of mild disinterest. "Excuse me," Ethan said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "Can you tell me how long this delay is expected to last? I'm transporting a military casket, and it's important that I get to my destination as soon as possible." The woman barely glanced up from her tablet. "All flights are delayed, sir," she said, her voice flat. "You'll have to wait like everyone else." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had been patient up until now, but this was starting to wear on him. "I understand that, but this isn't just any flight. There are protocols for military transports, and I need to ensure the casket is handled properly." The woman sighed dramatically, finally looking up at him with a hint of irritation in her eyes. "Sir, I understand that you think your situation is special, but we're short-staffed, and everyone's flight is delayed. You'll have to wait like the rest of us." Ethan's patience thinned even further, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Can you at least confirm the new departure time?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled frustration. With an exaggerated sigh, the woman tapped a few buttons on her screen. "Look, I don't have anything new yet. You'll just have to check back later." Ethan exhaled slowly, the knot in his chest tightening further. There was nothing he could do but wait, and it was infuriating. He had been through hell and back, had faced enemies who wanted nothing more than to see him fail, and yet here he was, stuck in a civilian airport, facing nothing but apathy and indifference. He glanced down at the dog tag in his hand, feeling the cool metal beneath his thumb. "I promise, Dave," he whispered under his breath. "I'm getting you home, no matter what." After pacing the terminal for what felt like hours, Ethan found himself a quiet corner and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morris, his old commanding officer. Morris had retired a few years ago, but he still had connections, still knew how to pull strings when it mattered. Ethan hesitated for a moment, not wanting to involve anyone else in this mess, but he knew he had no choice. He couldn't afford any more delays. He had to get to Dave's family. They were waiting, and every minute that passed was another minute of pain for them. He hit the call button and waited, his pulse quickening as the phone rang. "Jack Morris," came the familiar voice on the other end. "Colonel, it's Ethan Carter," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the frustration building inside him. "Ethan," Morris said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I heard about what happened with Thompson." "I'm sorry, man. He was a good soldier." "Yeah?" Ethan replied quietly, his throat tightening at the mention of Dave's name. "He was. Listen, I'm stuck at the airport, and things aren't moving as fast as they should be. I'm trying to get Dave home, but they've delayed the flight, and I'm getting the runaround from the airline staff. I need some help." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Morris responded. "Say no more. I'll make some calls. Sit tight." "Thanks, Colonel," Ethan said, feeling a small sense of relief wash over him. If anyone could cut through the red tape, it was Morris. After ending the call, Ethan leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. He was tired, more tired than he had been in a long time. The weight of the last few days, the endless delays, and the constant struggle against forces that seemed determined to make things harder than they needed to be, were starting to take their toll. But he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. He had a promise to keep. Ethan had barely been able to close his eyes for more than a few minutes before he heard a commotion nearby. When he opened his eyes, he saw a small crowd gathering near the airline desk, their attention focused on him. Phones were out, recording videos, and people were whispering to each other, pointing in his direction. He felt a sinking sensation in his chest. He had wanted to avoid attention, but it seemed like things were spiraling out of his control. "Is that the guy they were hassling earlier?" someone whispered loudly enough for Ethan to hear. "They're treating him like a criminal," another voice chimed in. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't want to be the center of attention, He didn't want this to become a spectacle. All he wanted was to get Dave home. But now it seemed like his ordeal was becoming something much bigger than he had intended. A man, middle-aged and holding a tablet, stepped forward from the crowd. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with concern, "are you okay? We saw what happened with security. They treated you like a suspect, not a soldier." Ethan managed a small nod, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm fine," he said, though the frustration in his voice was hard to miss. "You don't look fine," the man replied, his brow furrowing. "They shouldn't have treated you that way. I got the whole thing on video." Ethan exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. He appreciated the man's concern, but this was the last thing he needed. He didn't want to make this into a bigger issue than it already was. "Thanks," Ethan said, trying to sound grateful without encouraging more attention. "I just want to get home." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Ethan could feel the weight of their eyes on him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, he saw notifications from social media. Videos of his interaction with airport security had already started going viral, with hashtags like #RespectOurSoldiers and #Justice for Major Carter trending. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. This wasn't what he had wanted. All he had wanted was to fulfill his promise to Dave, but now the situation was spiraling beyond his control. As the crowd continued to whisper and record, Ethan stood up and walked toward the gate, trying to escape the growing attention. But even as he walked away, he knew that this was far from over. As Ethan sat back down, trying to block out the murmurs around him, his phone buzzed again, this time more insistently. With a sigh, he unlocked it and saw that the videos from the terminal were gaining traction faster than he could have anticipated. Dozens of notifications filled his screen, alerting him to the fact that people were commenting, liking, and sharing the footage of his encounter with security. Hashtags like #JusticeForCarter, #RespectOurSoldiers, and #NoMoreDelays were trending. Strangers online had taken up his cause without his consent, their outrage growing as the videos circulated. Clips of him being escorted to secondary screening were paired with captions accusing the airport of racial profiling. The situation had spiraled into a public spectacle, and Ethan could already see how this was going to unfold. His phone kept buzzing, each notification another reminder that he was losing control of the narrative. Messages began flooding in, some from strangers offering their support, others from reporters requesting interviews. Ethan swiped through the barrage of messages, his frustration growing. This wasn't supposed to be about him. It was about Dave. All he had wanted was to get his friend home. But now the focus had shifted, and his mission had been overshadowed by public outrage. A few feet away, the gathering crowd was still buzzing with energy, passengers whispering to each other as they watched him. Ethan felt their eyes on him, their curiosity thick in the air. The weight of it all was suffocating. He clenched his phone in his hand, trying to keep his composure. He had been trained to deal with pressure, to remain calm in the face of adversity, but this wasn't the battlefield. This was different. It was personal, and the last thing he wanted was to be the center of attention for something he had never asked for. Suddenly his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. Reluctantly, he answered, bracing himself for what was to come. "Major Carter?" A deep, authoritative voice came through the line. Ethan frowned, unsure of who he was speaking to. "Yes, this is Major Carter. This is General Robert Price. I heard about the situation at the airport, and I've seen the footage." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. General Price was a high-ranking officer, a man who commanded respect across all branches of the military. Ethan had served under him briefly during a joint operation years ago, and while they hadn't interacted much since, Price's reputation for leadership and integrity was well known. "Sir?" Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I didn't expect you to get involved." "Well, we don't let one of our own get mistreated without taking action," Price said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This situation has caught a lot of attention, and it's not just about you anymore, Major. The public is watching. We need to handle this carefully." Ethan exhaled slowly. He knew what Price was getting at. The viral videos, the hashtags, The growing protests outside the airport. They weren't going away anytime soon. Whether Ethan wanted it or not, this had become bigger than him. The way the military responded to this would send a message not just to the public, but to soldiers everywhere. "I understand, sir," Ethan said, his throat tightening. He had never wanted this kind of attention. He just wanted to do right by Dave. "I'm already making some calls to the airline and the airport," Price continued. "We'll get you on that flight as soon as possible. You have my word." Ethan nodded, even though Price couldn't see him. "Thank you, sir." "And Major," Price added, his tone softening slightly, "you've handled yourself with dignity through all of this. I know it's not easy, but you're setting an example, whether you realize it or not." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had spent his entire career trying to do the right thing, trying to be the kind of soldier others could look up to. But this wasn't the kind of example he had ever planned to set. "I'm just trying to bring my friend home, sir," Ethan said quietly. "I know," Price replied, "and we're going to make sure that happens. Hang in there, Major. We've got your back." The call ended, and Ethan sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of General Price's words settle over him. The military was stepping in now. Things were in motion, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this situation had grown beyond his control. The world was watching, and every decision he made from here on out would be scrutinized. He took a deep breath, centering himself. No matter what happened, his priority was Dave. That was the mission. Everything else was secondary. As the hours dragged on, the situation at the airport continued to escalate. The protest outside had grown from a small group of concerned citizens to a full-blown demonstration. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs that read, "Respect our soldiers," and "No justice, no peace." Chants of equal treatment now echoed through the terminal walls, the voices of the protesters loud and unyielding. Ethan watched from the window, feeling a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was grateful for the support. These people, strangers, had seen the injustice of what had happened to him, and they had decided to stand up and demand change. But on the other hand, he felt a growing unease. This wasn't supposed to be about him. It wasn't supposed to be about racial profiling or public outrage. It was supposed to be about getting Dave home. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Morris. "Made some calls. Flight should be cleared soon. Hang tight." Ethan felt a flicker of relief. He was one step closer to getting out of this airport, one step closer to fulfilling his promise to Dave. But the protests outside weren't going away, and the longer they lasted, the more the media took notice. Reporters had already begun to arrive inside the terminal, their cameras trained on the crowd of passengers who had witnessed Ethan's ordeal. One by one, journalists approached the passengers, asking for interviews, trying to get a sense of the story that was unfolding in real time. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they came to him. Sure enough, it didn't take long. A group of reporters, cameras in hand, made their way over to where Ethan was sitting. He straightened his posture, preparing himself for the onslaught of questions he knew was coming. "Major Carter," one of the reporters called out as they neared him, her voice urgent. "Can you comment on the way you were treated by airport security?" Ethan met her gaze, keeping his expression neutral. "I have no comment," he said firmly. The reporter, undeterred, pressed on. "Do you believe this incident is part of a larger issue of discrimination against black servicemen?" Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar sting of frustration. He knew what she was trying to do, trying to turn this into a story about systemic racism, trying to get him to say something that would inflame the situation even more. But he wasn't going to play into it. "I'm just here to bring my friend home," Ethan said, his voice steady but cold. "That's all I have to say." The reporter wasn't satisfied, but she backed off slightly, sensing that she wasn't going to get the soundbite she wanted. Another journalist stepped forward, his microphone raised. "Major, the public wants to know how you feel about the protests outside. Do you support the demonstration?" Ethan exhaled slowly, keeping his temper in check. "I appreciate the support, but I'm focused on my mission right now. That's all that matters." The reporters exchanged glances, clearly hoping for more, but Ethan had given them all he was willing to give. He wasn't here to make headlines. He wasn't here to become a symbol for anything other than the promise he had made to Dave. After a few more minutes of futile questioning, the reporters finally backed off, turning their attention back to the passengers and the protest outside. Ethan watched them go, feeling a surge of exhaustion wash over him. He had been through more than enough in the past few days, and the last thing he needed was to become the center of a media circus. But whether he liked it or not, the world had already taken notice. And there was no turning back now. As the day wore on, the tension inside the airport grew more palpable. The airline staff, once indifferent and dismissive, now moved with a nervous energy, clearly aware of the growing public outrage. The management had called an emergency meeting, and rumors were circulating that the CEO of the airline had been contacted directly by General Price. Ethan sat near the gate, his hands folded in his lap, trying to block out the noise around him. He had never liked being in the spotlight. He had always preferred to do his job quietly, without fanfare. But now he was being thrust into the middle of a situation he hadn't asked for. And it was wearing on him. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from General Price. "We've contacted the airline's CEO. They're fast-tracking your flight. Stay calm." Ethan felt a flicker of relief, but it was tempered by the weight of everything that had happened. The flight might be cleared soon, but the damage had already been done. This wasn't just about a delayed flight anymore. This was about how the world treated people like him, even when they wore the uniform. A few minutes later, one of the airline's senior representatives approached him. The man's face was pale, his expression tight with anxiety. "Major Carter," he began, his voice shaky, "we deeply regret the way you've been treated today. Please allow me to personally apologize on behalf of the airline." Ethan looked up at the man, his expression unreadable. He wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in results. "The flight is ready for boarding," the representative continued. "We've arranged for your priority boarding, and the casket will be handled with the utmost care. We've also arranged for complimentary access to our VIP lounge if you'd like to rest before the flight." Ethan stood up, his posture rigid. "I don't need an upgrade," he said quietly. "I just need to get home." The representative swallowed nervously, clearly unsure how to respond. "Of course, Major. We're doing everything we can to expedite the process." Ethan gave him a curt nod and walked toward the gate. He wasn't here for special treatment. He wasn't here to be placated with hollow apologies. He was here for Dave, and that was all that mattered. After hours of waiting, the flight was finally ready for boarding. Ethan made his way toward the gate, his back straight, his mind focused. As he approached, he saw Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morris waiting for him near the entrance, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with a mixture of frustration and determination. "About time they got their act together," Morris muttered as Ethan approached. Ethan gave a faint smile, though the weariness in his eyes was hard to miss. "Thanks for your help, Colonel." Morris clapped him on the shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. This never should have happened in the first place." Ethan nodded, knowing that Morris was right. But there was no point dwelling on it now. The most important thing was that he was finally getting on that plane. Dave's journey was almost over. As they approached the boarding area, the airline staff moved with newfound urgency, eager to avoid further scrutiny. The casket, draped in the American flag, was carefully loaded onto the plane, and Ethan watched every movement with a hawk-like gaze, ensuring that everything was done with the respect Dave deserved. The gate agent, looking nervous but determined to make things right, gestured toward the boarding door. "The flight is ready when you are, Major Carter." Ethan gave a single nod. "Let's go." The plane roared to life as it taxied down the runway, its engines rumbling beneath Ethan's feet. He sat quietly in his seat, the low hum of the aircraft filling the cabin as the landscape of the airport receded into the distance. Next to him, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morris gave him a supportive nod before retreating to his own thoughts. Ethan, too, found himself lost in the silence of the flight. His mind drifted back to the events of the past few days, the delays, the obstacles, the protests, and the unexpected public attention. He had never imagined that what should have been a simple mission, honoring a fallen comrade by bringing him home, would turn into such a spectacle. And yet here he was, exhausted but determined to finish what he had started. He stared out the small window beside him, watching as the plane ascended into the clouds. Beneath him, Dave's casket was secure in the cargo hold, draped in the American flag that symbolized the sacrifice Dave had made for his country. Ethan clenched his fist around the dog tag in his pocket, the weight of it a constant reminder of the promise he had sworn to keep. "We're almost there, brother," Ethan whispered to himself. "Just a little longer." The hours passed slowly as the plane crossed over the familiar terrain of the eastern United States. As they neared their destination, the rising sun began to cast a warm glow over the clouds, illuminating the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a quiet moment, one that gave Ethan a brief sense of peace despite the weight of his mission. When the captain announced their descent into Pennsylvania, Ethan straightened in his seat. His pulse quickened, and he felt the tension in his muscles ease slightly. He was almost there. After everything he had been through, after every delay and every confrontation, he was finally about to deliver Dave home to the people who loved him most. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, Ethan felt a sense of finality settle over him. The end of this journey was in sight, but he knew that the hardest part was still ahead, saying goodbye to Dave for the last time, standing before his family, and delivering the man they had sent off to war. These were the moments that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The small town of Clearbrook, Pennsylvania, was as quiet as Ethan had expected. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the main street as the military transport vehicle rolled slowly toward the cemetery. It was a peaceful, unassuming town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. And the weight of a loss, like Dave's, was felt by the entire community. Ethan rode in the front seat of the vehicle, his eyes trained on the road ahead. In the back, Dave's casket lay covered in the American flag, the symbol of honor and sacrifice that had accompanied him throughout his journey home. The streets were lined with people, some holding flags, others simply standing in silence as they watched the procession pass by. It was a somber scene, and Ethan could feel the weight of the town's collective grief pressing down on him. As they neared the cemetery, Ethan spotted Dave's family standing near the entrance. His mother, pale and fragile, clutched a worn photograph of her son, her eyes filled with unspeakable sorrow. Dave's father stood beside her, his posture stiff and formal, though his grief was written in every line of his face. Behind them, a small group of friends and extended family waited, their expressions a mixture of heartbreak and quiet respect. When the vehicle came to a stop, Ethan stepped out, his legs heavy with exhaustion, but his resolve unbroken. The honor guard moved into position, lifting the casket from the vehicle with the kind of precision and care that only soldiers could perform. As they carried Dave toward the burial site, Ethan walked behind them, his gaze focused on the flag that draped his friend's body. The cemetery itself was small and well kept, its rows of headstones gleaming in the early morning light. As they reached the burial site, the honor guard carefully lowered the casket onto the platform, their movements slow and deliberate. The air was heavy with reverence, and Ethan stood at attention as the ceremony began. The chaplain, an older man with kind eyes, stepped forward to offer words of comfort. His voice was soft but steady as he spoke of Dave's courage, his sacrifice, and the love he had for his family and his country. The words seemed to hang in the air, their weight undeniable. Ethan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the flag. He had said his goodbyes to Dave in his own way, in the stillness of the battlefield where they had shared their final moments. But now, standing here in this small cemetery, surrounded by the people who had known Dave as a son, a brother, and a friend, the reality of the loss hit him all over again. As the chaplain's words came to an end, the mournful notes of taps filled the air, played by a lone bugler standing near the edge of the cemetery. The sound was haunting, a final farewell to a soldier who had given everything for his country. Ethan felt the sting of tears in his eyes, but he blinked them back, keeping his posture rigid and his expression calm. When the casket was lowered into the ground, Ethan stepped forward. His hand raised in a crisp salute, a gesture of respect for the man who had saved his life more times than he could count. The promise he had made to Dave, the promise that had guided him through every obstacle, was finally fulfilled. After the ceremony, Ethan stayed behind while most of the mourners slowly made their way to their cars. The weight of the day hung over him as he stood at the edge of the grave, his hands folded behind his back. Dave's mother, her face streaked with tears, approached him cautiously, her hands trembling as she held a small folded letter in her hand. "Major Carter," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dave wrote this for you before he left for deployment. He asked me to give it to you if anything ever happened to him." Ethan's heart clenched as he took the letter, his fingers brushing against the worn paper. He could feel the weight of Dave's words inside, the final message from his best friend. He swallowed hard, nodding to Mrs. Thompson as she wiped away her tears. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He was the best man I ever knew." Mrs. Thompson gave him a sad, grateful smile before turning back to her family. Ethan watched her go, his chest heavy with the unspoken grief that had settled deep within him. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring down at the folded letter in his hand. Then, with a deep breath, he unfolded it carefully. The words scrawled in Dave's familiar handwriting, bringing an immediate sense of both comfort and pain. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you did what you always do. You kept your promise. You've always been the best soldier I've known, but more than that, you've been the best friend I could have asked for. I know you're carrying a lot of weight right now, and I know you'll keep pushing forward like you always do. But if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. You don't have to carry it all alone. Take care of yourself, brother. You've earned that. I'll see you on the other side." The tears Ethan had been holding back finally fell as he refolded the letter and slipped it into his pocket, right next to Dave's dog tag. He had kept his promise, just as Dave had known he would. But the journey wasn't over yet. As he turned to leave the cemetery, Ethan glanced back at the grave one last time. The finality of it all was overwhelming, but he knew that Dave's memory would stay with him, guiding him in the days and years to come. In the weeks following Dave's burial, Ethan found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded since his return from Afghanistan. The delays, the public attention, the protests, all of it had forced him to confront not just the challenges of fulfilling his promise to Dave, but the larger issues that had plagued him throughout his military career. He had never been one to seek out the spotlight, but the viral nature of his ordeal at the airport had thrust him into a position of influence that he hadn't expected. The support he had received from the public, from fellow soldiers, and from his own superiors had been overwhelming, but it had also made him realize that there were still battles to be fought. Battles for equality, for respect, for the dignity of every soldier who wore the uniform, no matter their race. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch of his small apartment, Ethan received a message from General Price. It was short, but it carried a weight that Ethan couldn't ignore. "We're launching an initiative to address the issues that surfaced in your situation. We need leaders like you on board. Call me when you're ready." Ethan read the message twice before setting his phone down. The world had changed in the weeks since he had returned home, and it was clear that his fight wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done, work that went beyond the battlefield and into the very heart of the system that had both supported and failed him at different points in his career. He thought about Dave's letter, about the words his friend had left behind. You don't have to carry it all alone. With a deep breath, Ethan stood up. He had fulfilled his promise to Dave, but now it was time to take on a new mission. This time, he wouldn't be fighting for just one soldier. He would be fighting for all of them. As he looked out at the horizon, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter than it had in weeks. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it head-on, just as he had faced every challenge in his life. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the dog tag and holding it in his hand for a moment. "We're not done yet, brother," Ethan whispered, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not by a long shot." And with that, he stepped forward, ready to meet the battles that lay ahead. Not as a victim, but as a soldier a leader, and a man with unbreakable resolve. Months had passed since Dave's burial, but the memory of that day remained fresh in Ethan's mind. He had returned to his daily life, trying to adjust to the quieter rhythm of civilian life after years spent in the military. But even as he settled back into the routine, the weight of everything he had been through lingered. A constant reminder of the promise he had fulfilled and the new path that lay before him. Ethan sat in his small home office, surrounded by framed photographs of his military career. Some were of his time in Afghanistan, others were from earlier deployments. But the one that always caught his eye was the photo of him and Dave, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning despite the dust and grime of the battlefield. It was a simple photo, taken on a day that had been ordinary, yet it had come to mean so much more in the months since Dave's death. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo for a long time. Dave's letter, still tucked safely in the top drawer of his desk, was a constant source of strength. But it also served as a reminder of the larger battle Ethan now faced, the battle for systemic change within the military, and for the respect and dignity of every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. Ethan had never imagined himself as an advocate or a public figure. He had always been a soldier first, a man who did his job and asked for nothing in return. But the events of the past months had thrust him into a position of influence, and now, with the support of General Price and others in the military, Ethan knew he had a responsibility to carry that influence forward. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from General Price, brief and to the point as always. Meeting with the Defense Department tomorrow. Need your input. Call me when you can. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. This was it, the next step in the mission that had begun on the battlefield and carried him through to this moment. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Dave, for every soldier who had faced the same struggles, and for the future of the military itself. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ethan stood up from his desk. He had never shied away from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. The next morning, Ethan found himself in the familiar surroundings of Washington, D.C. The streets bustled with government workers, military personnel, and politicians, all moving with purpose toward their various destinations. Ethan had been here before, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just a soldier reporting for duty. He was a man on a mission to create real change. The meeting with General Price and key members of the Defense Department had been arranged to discuss the very issues that had surfaced during Ethan's ordeal at the airport. It wasn't just about his own experience, it was about addressing the systemic problems that had long affected soldiers of color, about finding ways to ensure that what had happened to him wouldn't happen again. As Ethan walked through the halls of the Defense Department, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors, he felt a surge of determination. He had always been a soldier who believed in action, and now he was being given the opportunity to take that action in a way that could impact not just his fellow servicemen, but future generations of soldiers as well. General Price greeted him with a firm handshake as they entered the meeting room. "Glad you could make it, Major," Price said, his tone formal but warm. "We've got a lot to cover today." Ethan nodded, taking a seat at the table alongside other high-ranking officials. As the discussion began, it became clear that the military was ready to listen. They had seen the public reaction to Ethan's story, and they understood that change was necessary, not just to prevent further incidents like his, but to address the larger issues of discrimination and inequality within the ranks. The meeting lasted for hours, filled with discussions about policy changes, new training programs, and initiatives aimed at creating a more inclusive environment for soldiers of all backgrounds. Ethan listened carefully, offering his insights where needed, but more than anything, he felt a sense of hope. This was the start of something important, something that could reshape the very foundation of the military. As the meeting ended, General Price pulled Ethan aside. "We're going to need people like you to lead the charge on this," Price said, his tone serious. "The changes we're discussing today, they're just the beginning. We need leaders who understand the stakes, who've lived it, Ethan met Price's gaze, feeling the weight of the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. "I'm ready, sir," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Price nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's what I was hoping to hear." Later that week, Ethan found himself back in Clearbrook, Pennsylvania, standing once again at Dave's gravesite. The small cemetery was quiet, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. It was a peaceful place, and for a moment Ethan allowed himself to simply breathe in the serenity of the surroundings. He hadn't been back since the day of the funeral, but it felt right to return now. So much had changed in the months since Dave's burial, and yet, standing here, Ethan felt the same sense of loss he had carried with him since the day his best friend had died on the battlefield. Ethan knelt down beside the grave, placing a small bouquet of flowers next to the headstone. The words etched into the stone, "Sergeant David Thompson, beloved son, brother, and friend," were a stark reminder of the man who had given everything for his country. "I kept my promise," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I got you home, Dave." For a long moment he remained there, his hand resting on the headstone as he thought about everything that had happened. The journey to bring Dave home had been filled with challenges, but in the end, Ethan had fulfilled his promise. And now he was embarking on a new mission, a mission that he knew Dave would have been proud of. Ethan pulled Dave's dog tag from his pocket, the same one he had carried with him throughout the journey, and held it in his hand. It had become a symbol of their bond, of the promise they had made to each other as soldiers and brothers. "I'm still fighting," Ethan whispered, "but this time it's for something bigger. For all of us." As the sun began to set behind the rolling hills, casting a warm golden light over the cemetery, Ethan stood up. He looked out at the horizon, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to face, but for the first time in months, he felt ready to take on whatever challenges came his way. The following months were filled with meetings, speeches, and initiatives aimed at bringing about the changes Ethan had fought so hard for. The military had committed to implementing new policies that addressed racial bias, both in the ranks and in the way. Soldiers were treated by the institutions that supported them. Ethan became a key figure in these efforts, his voice and his experiences guiding the conversation. The support he received from fellow soldiers, veterans, and civilians alike was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to thank him for standing up, for speaking out, and for leading the charge on an issue that had long been ignored. Ethan, though humbled by the attention, remained focused on the mission at hand. This was never about fame or recognition. It was about making sure that every soldier, regardless of their background, was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. As the months turned into a year, the changes began to take root. Training programs were updated to address racial and cultural sensitivity. New guidelines were put in place to ensure that soldiers like Ethan would never face the kind of disrespect he had experienced at the airport. The military was evolving, and while there was still work to be done, the progress was undeniable. Ethan continued to serve as a leader in the movement, but he also found time to reflect on his own journey. He had faced more obstacles than he could have ever imagined, but through it all, he had remained true to his promise. To Dave, to himself, and to every soldier who had ever felt the sting of injustice. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch of his home, watching the sunset over the horizon, he received a message from General Price. "You've done good work, Major. We're just getting started." Ethan smiled as he read the message, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with where he was and where he was headed. As he looked out at the fading light of the day, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Dave's dog tag, holding it in his hand for a moment. "We're not done yet," Ethan whispered to himself, "but we're getting there." With that, he stood up, ready to face whatever the future held, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a soldier, a leader, and a man with unbreakable resolve. Ethan Carter's journey reminds us of the power of perseverance, honor, and the fight for justice in every form. His story, like so many others, shows that no matter the obstacles, it's the strength of our promises and the courage to stand up for what's right that defines us. If you were moved by this story and want to hear more about courage, determination, and the human spirit, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring light to the everyday heroes among us. Stay connected for more powerful journeys, and let us know what stories have touched you the most in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated with all our latest content.